A man starts spending differently the moment he feels someone pulling away from him, not logically, emotionally. It usually begins with something small. The replies get shorter, the energy changes. She still smiles, still responds, still says nothing's wrong, but something feels off. And without even realizing it, he starts compensating. He offers to pay for dinner more often, sends the extra message, suggests the weekend trip, buys the thoughtful gift she never directly asked for. Not because he suddenly became more generous, but because uncertainty quietly entered the interaction. And honestly, most men never notice the exact moment this shift begins happening. They think they're being attentive, mature, emotionally available. But over time, something changes in the dynamic. The more emotionally unsure he becomes, the more he starts performing, with attention, with effort, with money. That's usually the moment the balance quietly disappears. Because attraction doesn't only change behavior, it changes perception. A man who was once calm becomes reactive. A man who once moved naturally starts monitoring every text, every pause, every subtle emotional fluctuation like it contains hidden meaning. And the uncomfortable part? The other person can feel it, not always consciously, not always maliciously, but people notice when your emotional state starts depending on their approval, especially when money becomes part of that emotional language. A lot of modern relationships never become toxic overnight. They slowly drift into psychological negotiation. Affection starts influencing decision-making. Emotional distance starts affecting spending habits. Validation becomes tied to generosity. And eventually, some men stop asking themselves a very important question. Am I doing this because I genuinely want to, or because I'm afraid of what happens if I don't? That's the part nobody really talks about. Because manipulation rarely looks aggressive in real life. Most of the time, it looks subtle, reasonable, even romantic. A disappointed expression, a little emotional withdrawal, a comparison to another man, a sentence casually dropped into conversation that somehow stays in your head for days. And little by little, the interaction stops being about connection and starts becoming about emotional leverage. Niccolo Machiavelli understood something uncomfortable about human behavior. People respond more strongly to emotional certainty than good intentions. The person who controls emotional uncertainty often controls the dynamic itself. And once someone realizes your emotions, and eventually your wallet, can be influenced through fear of losing them, the interaction is never completely the same again. Most men never notice the exact moment the interaction stops being equal. It doesn't happen during a big argument or some dramatic betrayal. Usually, it happens quietly. A slight shift in behavior, a little more emotional distance, a little less certainty. And suddenly, the man who once felt calm starts trying harder without even realizing it. That's the strange part. The behaviors that slowly reduce your influence often look respectable at first. Being more understanding, more available, more generous, even financially. And honestly, most men think this makes them look emotionally mature. But over time, something uncomfortable starts happening beneath the surface. The more emotionally invested someone becomes, the more predictable they become. And predictability changes how people respond to you, especially when attention, validation, and money start moving in the same direction. Because once emotional tension enters the dynamic, spending rarely stays logical. A dinner becomes reassurance, a gift becomes emotional repair, a vacation becomes an attempt to restore certainty. And the disturbing part is, sometimes the other person doesn't even need to ask directly. That's how subtle these dynamics can become. A sentence, a disappointed look, A moment of withdrawal, and suddenly someone is over-explaining, over-giving, overspending, trying to get back a feeling they can't even fully describe. Niccolò Machiavelli understood something most people miss about human behavior. The person creating emotional uncertainty often learns very quickly who is willing to sacrifice the most to escape it. And most men never realize they're slowly giving away their leverage in real time. So let's start with the first tactic, the one that quietly changes a man's behavior before he even notices it happening. Truth number 1. Emotional withdrawal quietly changes a man's financial behavior. Most men don't notice how quickly they start changing their behavior the moment a woman becomes emotionally distant. It usually doesn't happen after a breakup or after some dramatic argument. It happens in smaller moments. The replies become shorter. The enthusiasm fades a little. The warmth feels inconsistent. She says she's just tired, just busy, just stressed. And suddenly, a man who was completely calm 2 weeks ago starts operating differently without even realizing it. He starts checking his phone more often, responding faster, thinking harder about what he said wrong, and eventually, spending differently. That's the uncomfortable part nobody talks about. At first it looks harmless, even caring. He offers dinner more often, plans the trip, sends money, buys gifts she never technically asked for. Not because generosity suddenly increased, but because emotional uncertainty entered the dynamic. And honestly, most men believe this behavior makes them look emotionally mature. But over time, something quietly shifts. The more someone senses you are afraid of losing the connection, the more the interaction starts revolving around emotional reassurance instead of genuine connection. A dinner stops being a dinner. It becomes emotional repair. A gift stops being thoughtful. It becomes anxiety management. That's usually the moment emotional tension starts influencing financial decisions. Not consciously, not maliciously every time, but predictably. Niccolò Machiavelli understood something deeply uncomfortable about human behavior. People pay close attention to where emotional certainty comes from. The person chasing reassurance is rarely controlling the emotional direction of the interaction. And in modern relationships, reassurance often becomes expensive. Not only financially, psychologically. Because once someone realizes their distance changes your behavior, they begin learning what controls you. That's why emotional discipline matters more than emotional intensity. Not coldness, not pretending not to care, just restraint. The ability to pause before reacting, to stop overcompensating every time tension appears, to notice when fear is quietly making decisions for you. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is observe the change without immediately trying to fix it. Because the moment people realize your emotions, and eventually your wallet, move every time they pull away, the interaction quietly stops feeling equal. Truth number 2. The moment you start performing financially, the dynamic quietly changes. You can usually tell when a man stops feeling emotionally secure in a relationship. He starts trying to prove himself more. Not directly, subtly. He becomes more available, more agreeable, more careful with his words, and eventually, more financially expressive. That's the strange pattern almost nobody talks about. A woman casually mentions a restaurant she wants to try, a vacation another couple posted online, a handbag she would never ask for, while still describing it in detail. Nothing aggressive, nothing explicit, and yet somehow the idea stays in his head for days. So he pays for the dinner, books the trip, buys the gift. Not always because he genuinely wants to, sometimes because he wants to feel chosen again. That's the uncomfortable layer underneath a lot of modern dating dynamics. At first it feels romantic, even generous. But over time, some men quietly begin attaching their value to how much they can provide emotionally, financially, and psychologically. And once that happens, the interaction starts becoming less natural, because people behave differently around someone who is constantly trying to earn emotional reassurance, especially when money becomes part of that reassurance. Niccolò Machiavelli understood something subtle about human behavior. People often reveal their emotional dependencies through what they cannot stop giving away. Sometimes it's attention, sometimes information, sometimes constant emotional availability, and sometimes it's money. Not because money itself matters most, but because spending becomes emotional signaling, a way of saying, please don't lose interest, please keep choosing me, please don't pull away. And honestly, people can feel that energy far more than most realize. That's why emotional restraint matters. Not stinginess, not emotional coldness, just awareness. Pay attention to moments where generosity suddenly appears after emotional tension. Notice when you feel the urge to impress instead of connect. Slow down before making emotional purchases during uncertainty, conflict, or distance. Because the moment financial behavior becomes tied to fear of losing someone, you stop making clear decisions. And once someone senses that your emotional state can influence your wallet, the entire interaction quietly changes. Truth number 3. The more you try to keep the peace, the easier you become to control. A lot of men think staying calm in every situation makes them emotionally mature. So when tension appears in a relationship, they immediately try to smooth everything over. They explain themselves carefully, apologize quickly, avoid conflict, try to fix the vibe before things become uncomfortable. At first it seems responsible, even admirable, but over time, something subtle starts happening in the interaction. The person constantly trying to preserve emotional harmony usually becomes the one carrying all the emotional pressure. And honestly, most people never even notice when this shift begins. You see it in small moments. A conversation suddenly becomes cold. The energy changes. You can feel disappointment in the room, even if nobody says anything directly. So you rush to repair it. You buy dinner, send the long message, offer reassurance nobody asked for. Not because you did something terrible, but because silence started making you uncomfortable. That's usually when emotional asymmetry quietly enters the relationship. One person becomes reactive. The other becomes emotionally harder to read. And the more reactive someone becomes, the easier their behavior becomes to predict. Niccolò Machiavelli understood something uncomfortable about human nature. People often respond more strongly to emotional steadiness than emotional sincerity. The person constantly trying to prove good intentions usually reveals more emotional dependency than they realize, especially under tension, because conflict reveals patterns. Who panics first? Who over-explains? Who spends money to restore closeness? Who cannot tolerate emotional distance? And once those patterns become visible, the dynamic rarely stays the same. That's why emotional restraint matters. Not silence as punishment, not emotional games, just the ability to stay internally composed when tension appears. Sometimes you do not need to immediately explain yourself. You do not need to repair every awkward silence. You do not need to spend money every time emotional discomfort enters the room. Pause first. Observe the interaction before reacting to it, Because many people are not responding to your words as much as they are responding to your emotional behavior underneath them. And the moment someone realizes discomfort makes you easier to influence, they begin learning exactly where your emotional pressure points are. And that's where the next tactic becomes even more dangerous. Truth number 4. The faster you react emotionally, the easier you become to read. You can learn a lot about a person by watching how quickly they react when emotional tension appears. Some people can sit with uncertainty for a while. Others immediately start trying to close the gap. That's usually where the dynamic quietly starts changing. A woman takes longer to reply than usual. Her energy feels different for 2 days. Maybe she becomes colder after a small disagreement. And suddenly the man is emotionally sprinting, double texting, checking social media, trying to fix the atmosphere before anything has even been clearly communicated. And honestly, most men think this behavior proves emotional investment, but in reality, it often reveals emotional urgency. That's an important difference, because the moment someone realizes your emotional state changes rapidly based on their behavior, your reactions start becoming predictable, and predictable people are easy to emotionally steer. You see this happen constantly in dating dynamics. The moment emotional uncertainty appears, some men immediately increase effort, more attention, more reassurance, more availability, sometimes more spending too. A surprise gift after tension, an expensive dinner after emotional distance, a trip planned during instability because silence suddenly feels unbearable. At first it feels caring, but underneath it, there's often something else happening, an attempt to regain emotional certainty as quickly as possible. Niccolo Machiavelli understood that emotional control was often less about force and more about timing. The person reacting first usually reveals more than they intend to, especially under pressure, because pressure exposes patterns. Who becomes impulsive, who starts over-explaining, who suddenly becomes financially generous the moment emotional tension enters the room. And people notice those shifts far more than most realize. That's why emotional discipline is not about suppressing feelings. It's about slowing down your reactions enough to actually observe what's happening before your emotions begin making decisions for you. Pause before sending the extra message. Pause before spending money to restore closeness. Pause before assuming emotional distance automatically means rejection. Sometimes tension is information, not an emergency. And the people who remain internally steady during uncertainty usually see the interaction more clearly than everyone else in it. Because once someone learns they can influence your behavior simply by changing their emotional availability, the entire relationship starts moving around your reactions instead of genuine connection. Truth number 5. The need to be seen as good makes you easy to influence. A lot of men don't realize how much of their behavior is driven by the fear of looking selfish. You see it in conversations all the time. A woman becomes slightly disappointed, maybe emotionally distant. Maybe she casually mentions how other men used to do more, and suddenly the atmosphere changes. Now he's trying to prove something, not aggressively, quietly. He offers to pay, buys the thoughtful gift, changes his plans, starts explaining how much he cares even when nobody directly asked him to. And honestly, most of the time, he believes he's simply being considerate. But underneath that behavior, there's often a deeper psychological pattern happening. The need to maintain a certain image. The good boyfriend, the emotionally mature man, the generous provider, the man who never disappoints. At first, those qualities sound admirable, But the moment someone realizes your identity depends on being perceived that way, the interaction quietly changes. Because now emotional tension becomes leverage. A disappointed reaction affects your decisions. Silence affects your spending. Withdrawal affects your behavior. And little by little, your actions stop coming from clarity and start coming from emotional pressure. That's the uncomfortable part nobody talks about. Niccolò Machiavelli understood that perception often shapes behavior more effectively than direct force ever could. People rarely need to explicitly control someone who is already psychologically trying to preserve an image, especially an image tied to approval. Because once approval becomes emotionally necessary, influence becomes subtle. A sigh across the dinner table, a comparison to another relationship, a sentence like, "I guess I just got used to disappointment." And suddenly someone is spending money, over-explaining or over-committing just to escape the feeling of being perceived as inadequate. Not because they truly want to, because emotionally they no longer feel free to say no comfortably. That's why emotional awareness matters. Notice when guilt starts influencing your decisions. Notice when generosity begins feeling emotionally compulsory instead of natural. Notice when you start performing emotionally instead of connecting honestly. You do not need to become cold. You do not need to stop caring. But you do need to become aware of how quickly the desire to be seen as good can quietly reshape your behavior. Because once someone senses that your self-worth depends on their approval, the interaction stops being emotionally balanced without you even noticing it. Truth number 6. The person who makes you feel guilty often gains the most influence over you. You can tell a lot about a relationship by observing who feels guilty the fastest. Some people experience tension and simply talk about it. Others immediately start feeling responsible for emotions that were never clearly communicated in the first place. That's where things quietly become psychologically dangerous. A woman becomes colder for a few days. Her tone changes. She seems disappointed, but says very little directly. And suddenly the man starts mentally retracing everything. Did I say something wrong? Was I not attentive enough? Did I disappoint her somehow? So he compensates. More attention, more emotional reassurance, sometimes more money. Dinner becomes an apology nobody asked for. A gift becomes an attempt to remove tension from the room. A financial gesture becomes emotional repair. And honestly, most men don't even realize guilt is influencing their behavior in real time. Because guilt rarely feels aggressive. It feels moral. It feels like maturity, like accountability, like being a good man. But the moment guilt starts controlling your decisions more than clarity does, the interaction quietly changes, especially when emotional disappointment starts affecting how much you give, spend, or tolerate. Niccolò Machiavelli understood something subtle about human nature. People often reveal their emotional vulnerabilities through the things they feel obligated to constantly prove. And guilt is one of the strongest emotional pressures in social dynamics because it bypasses logic completely. Nobody needs to directly demand anything from you once you begin emotionally policing yourself. That's the uncomfortable part. A sigh can change your behavior. A disappointed look can affect your spending. Silence can create emotional pressure stronger than direct words. Not always intentionally, not always maliciously, but very real. That's why emotional discipline matters so much in modern relationships. Not defensiveness, not emotional detachment, just the ability to separate genuine accountability from emotional pressure. Pause before immediately trying to repair tension. Pause before assuming every uncomfortable emotion in the room belongs to you. Pause before spending money simply to restore emotional certainty. Because mature relationships are built on communication, not silent emotional debt. And once someone realizes guilt makes you easier to influence, they no longer need to control you directly. Your own emotions start doing it for them. Truth number 7. Some people don't want your money. They want proof they can influence it. You can learn a lot about a relationship by watching what happens after emotional tension enters the room. Some men become quieter, some become distant, others start spending. That's usually the pattern nobody notices until it's already controlling the dynamic. A woman becomes emotionally colder for a few days, less enthusiastic, less affectionate, less emotionally available. And suddenly the man starts over-investing financially. A random expensive dinner, a shopping trip, an impulsive vacation, money sent just to help. Gifts appearing after emotional distance that was never even clearly discussed. And honestly, most of the time he believes he's simply being loving. But underneath it, something psychologically deeper is often happening. He is trying to restore emotional certainty. That's why this dynamic becomes so dangerous. Because once emotions begin influencing financial behavior, the interaction quietly stops being about money. It becomes about emotional leverage. The spending itself is rarely the real point. The real point is this: can your emotions change someone's behavior? Can disappointment influence their decisions? Can silence affect their generosity? Can emotional withdrawal increase their willingness to provide? And once that pattern becomes visible, people start responding to you differently. Not always consciously, not always maliciously, but human beings naturally pay attention to emotional influence. Niccolò Machiavelli understood that people reveal their emotional vulnerabilities through what they consistently sacrifice to maintain connection. For some people, it's honesty. For others, self-respect. For many men in modern relationships, it becomes money. Not because they are weak, because emotional attachment clouds self-awareness faster than most realize, especially when approval, affection, and financial behavior become psychologically connected. That's why emotional discipline matters so much. Not becoming cold, not refusing generosity, just learning to separate genuine desire from emotional pressure. Pause before spending money during emotional instability. Notice when generosity suddenly appears after distance or tension. Pay attention to whether your financial decisions are coming from clarity or fear of losing emotional access. Because healthy generosity feels calm. It does not feel anxious, compulsive, or emotionally urgent. And once someone realizes they can influence your emotional state strongly enough to influence your wallet, the relationship quietly stops being emotionally equal. The strange part is, once you start noticing these patterns, you can't really unsee them anymore. You begin recognizing how quickly emotional dynamics change the moment approval becomes necessary. How people behave differently around someone who constantly explains themselves. How silence affects interactions more than words sometimes do. How emotional uncertainty quietly changes behavior long before anyone openly admits it. And honestly, most of these shifts happen quietly. That's why people miss them. No dramatic betrayal, no obvious turning point, just small adjustments repeated over time. A little more emotional chasing, a little more over-explaining, a little more spending to maintain closeness, a little more anxiety every time the emotional atmosphere changes. And eventually, someone stops acting naturally altogether. That's usually how emotional dependence works, not loudly, gradually. Niccolò Machiavelli understood something uncomfortable about human behavior. People are deeply influenced by emotional perception, often more than logic itself. Not because human beings are evil, because emotional tension changes decision-making faster than most people realize. Especially when loneliness, validation, attraction, money, and approval all start blending together. That's why awareness matters so much. Not paranoia, not emotional coldness, not becoming cynical toward relationships, just awareness. The ability to notice when your emotions are being pulled before your behavior follows them. The ability to sit with uncertainty without immediately trying to buy reassurance from someone emotionally unavailable. The ability to recognize when generosity is genuine and when it's quietly becoming emotional negotiation. Because mature social awareness is not about controlling other people. It's about no longer being unconsciously controlled by emotional pressure yourself. And the truth is, most people spend years reacting to dynamics they never fully understand. They confuse emotional urgency with love. They confuse anxiety with connection. They confuse overgiving with loyalty. Meanwhile, the people who remain calm, observant, and emotionally grounded usually see the interaction far more clearly. That's the real shift. Not becoming harder to emotionally destabilize. And once that happens, conversations feel different. Relationships feel different. Even silence starts feeling different. Because you stop needing every interaction to constantly reassure you, and that changes the way people respond to you more than most realize. If this video made you look at relationships, emotional tension, or human behavior differently, subscribe. Not for entertainment, for awareness. Because most people go their entire lives repeating these patterns without ever seeing them clearly. And if you've experienced any of these dynamics yourself, leave a comment below. I control my emotions before they control me. Or tell me which psychological pattern hit you the hardest. The next videos are going even deeper into emotional withdrawal, silence, psychology, hidden social leverage, attention dynamics. Why perceived value shifts so quietly in relationships, and the behaviors that secretly change how people treat you over time. Stay observant, stay emotionally disciplined, and pay attention to the moments where people stop reacting to your words and start reacting to your emotional patterns instead. Because once you truly understand human behavior, you stop moving through the world unconsciously.